So thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to be here. I've had a chance to give this talk across the United States, and it's been really exciting to know that my obscure little topic actually has some wider interest, and some have agreed that it's not, in fact, so obscure and that it's relevant to things today, and that's my hope again this evening, although I certainly am not going to give a formal academic talk. I don't want to torture you after a long week, I'm sure, and I will proceed with informal remarks, and hopefully we'll have a discussion. So I'm very happy to be again in Tokyo, and of course at Temple. I grew up in Philadelphia, where Temple was synonymous with university. So one of my earliest memories is my mother graduating from Temple, as my aunt did, and pretty much everyone in my neighborhood. So whoever said you can't go home again obviously didn't grow up in Philadelphia and have a chance to come to Temple in Tokyo this evening. So I'd like to say a few words about how I got interested in this topic. During the campaign which ultimately elected Barack Obama, I spoke to many of my Japanese friends about their perception of this, what would be historic election, the election of an African-American president. And it occurred to me, and I ended up writing an article for the Asahi Shimbun on the subject, that there was something indeed significant about watching America make an important transition from a clearly white country to a country that was a little less clearly white. Maybe something else, maybe something different. And that this was important because, in fact, the Pacific War had been fought on both sides in racial terms, and Japan had been occupied in terms that while the United States was shifting to promoting itself as a pan-racial force in the world, was still nonetheless a white country occupying a non-white country, and that was the perception. So that the election of Obama was extraordinarily significant. And I remember reading one statistic that while something like over 80% of Democrats wanted Obama to win, something close to 90% of Japanese people wanted Barack Obama to win and become president. So quite significant. And that was my entry into understanding the fact that the relationship between African Americans in particular and Japanese is quite historic. Certainly going back before the time of Prime Minister Nakasone's infamous remarks in 1986, that America was slowed down by the presence of its minorities, even as it was translated, and that in fact there had been what some might term a golden era of black-Japanese relations. And that's what I began to write about and what I'm going to present briefly this evening. So I don't know if you can see the slide or if it's better to have the lights down or off. Down or off? Is that better? So can someone identify this American city? New York, that's right, it's New York. And as you can see, New York is being bombed by Japanese airplanes. What year did that happen? If you have an answer, just keep it to yourself, actually. And let me go back 20 years before this picture was rendered and read you an excerpt. After the Imperial Navy destroyed the American fleet at Midway, the Pacific became a highway for the advancing Japanese forces. The conquest of Hawaii enabled the Japanese to launch an invasion of the west coast of the United States and establish bases bombing the Midwest. As expected, Japanese efforts against the more powerful foe benefited from the uprising of 10 million black Americans led by Marcus Garvey. The beaten Americans sued for peace after a successful attack on New York. In the wake of their victories, Japanese emissaries gloated as a humbled Lothrop Stoddard participated in the negotiations. Now it's understandable that during war you would see a fantasy rendered such as this, where Japanese planes are bombing the exterior-most point of the United States. But the excerpt I read you was from 1921, written by a gentleman, Sato Kojiro, in a fantasy of war between Japan and the United States. And the question is, why in 1921 would Sato be conjuring such a fantasy with such rich detail, and of course detail involving Marcus Garvey, of course a great, if not the most famous black nationalist of the period. And in a sense, that's our question to answer today. So I'm interested in African-American-Japanese relations from 1905 to 1941. 1905, because that's the end of the Russo-Japanese War. In 1941, the beginning of the Pacific War, when African Americans were once again asked to show loyalty to the United States, which they did, to join the American Army, armed forces, in a conscious effort to achieve a double victory, that is, to fight loyally with the United States abroad, and therefore have even more leverage to pursue civil rights at home. Now, the reference to Lothrop Stoddard, I'll just add for those of you who are fans of American literature, Stoddard is the real figure on which, in The Great Gatsby, if anyone knows that novel, the character Goddard is modeled on. Goddard was the author of a book, The Passing of a Great Race. And in fact, Stoddard was an author writing about the perils of the pending end of white and Western hegemony. White people were, it was understood, a minority, dominating the majority of non-white people in the world. And as Stoddard, the real person, and Goddard, the character in Fitzgerald's novel, were understanding, those non-whites were talking to one another and strategizing for the future. Now, the global appeal stems from the beginning of African-American globalism and nationalism. Here we have one of the earliest tracks, David Walker. If you notice, it appealed to the colored citizens of the world, just as chains and fences and the lash and branding kept African Americans physically in their place. The sense of not having a history, the sense of not being part of a people larger than this continent, larger than the region of the South, was extraordinarily important for maintaining the system of slavery in perpetuity, guided by race, guided by the one-drop rule that any person of African-American descent would be African-American, and therefore in America synonymous with slavery. So the appeal of global consciousness is not new, but it gained enormous power, and we can't underestimate how much, at the turn of the 20th century, indeed because of the Russo-Japanese War. The first time in history, in modern history, a non-white, quote-unquote, non-white nation, in quotes because these things can be arbitrary, had defeated, quote, a white nation. And this, of course, prompted African Americans, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, who's depicted here, to note that the color line, in fact, had been broken. I'll say more about Du Bois. This is actually, in fact, a picture of Du Bois from a book written in Japan in the 1920s. It's interesting that he's called here Dubois, which of course would be the more correct French way to pronounce his name, but in fact Du Bois insisted that he was an American, that his name should be pronounced as such. It's kind of funny studying Du Bois. Sometimes I tell people about my topic and they say to me, "Oh, it's interesting that you're studying Dubois." And I say, "Oh yes, so no, I am studying Du Bois," which is how he pronounced his name. And we go from there. But in fact, Du Bois was proud of his Americanness, and that was part of it. So Du Bois, after 1905, said, "The magic of the word white has been ended forever, and the color line has been crossed in civilization." Does anyone know what this picture depicts? Jack Johnson, that's right, the defeat of the great white hope, Jack Johnson, in 1910, which was an image and an event all over the world taken to mean that, in fact, the presumption of white racial superiority, which at the time included physical superiority, was, in fact, just a fantasy. But what I say is that 5 years earlier, if you look at the black press, at least in America, an even more momentous event took place, which was again the defeat of the Russians. All over the world, this was depicted in racial terms. Here we have an image from Germany with Russia represented as a bear, the Japanese represented kind of as characters from the Mikado, but nonetheless in racial terms, as in Russia as well, Russian women depicted as virtuous and spreading health, whereas Japanese women licentious and spreading disease. And again, even the Japanese themselves, in this rather noble depiction of the Russians, you can still see a color gradation in the image, again, showing that there was a racial element to the conflict. Now, as far as viewing African Americans in Japan, it was noted rather objectively, without pejorative, that among the Portuguese who came to Japan there were people of darker hue. It was known, of course, that they came from Western Africa, both Southwest Africa and West Africa as well. Although there were depictions that were pejorative, I would say that the general attitude was neutral. And we know that the Japanese were capable of rendering foreigners and foreign things with, as pejoratively depicting their dismay. This is one of my, I think one of the most interesting images, this anthropomorphized ship, belching smoke and breathing fire. The sailors up on top in the mast looking like the kind of flies that would circle a stinking beast. And of course with people as well, capable of rendering in a negative way. And that's why the renderings of people of different races without a pejorative is interesting. Here, a black character, not an American. And in fact, the retainer of Nobunaga, a famous, probably from Angola, given to Nobunaga as a slave, who by the end of Nobunaga's life had attained the rank of a samurai, Yasu, or Yasukuro in this case, Kuroyasu, who in fact was one of the few who did not leave Nobunaga as he was being burned alive at the end of his life. This picture is from a 1950s children's book, which again shows a neutral, or in this case a positive depiction of African Americans. Very, very strangely, and I don't have an answer for this, maybe someone else does, but when Perry, in Opening Japan, wanted to depict an aspect of American culture, the Japanese put on a sumo match, and Perry put on a minstrel show. So I find it very strange, and I wonder how the Japanese viewing it at the time perceived this first contact with American culture, that white sailors were dressed up as black dancers and singers. Here's another depiction from the time. And this is doubly strange in that there were, in fact, there were actual African Americans that attended, and Perry had himself flanked by 2 African American sailors. The next 3 depictions I think are interesting again because they build the case for neutrality. Each has a different hue. You see the gentleman seated is slightly different complected than this first image, as is the last, a kind of gray color skin. And again, I would say that that means that there's no fixed identification of race, but a gradation of color showing simply color difference without any necessary pejorative. Now, well, let's fast forward in the interest of time to something that I think is truly interesting and representative of this period, again, between 1905 and 1941. How many people here know who Madam C.J. Walker was? Heard the name? So a few people. Madam C.J. Walker was one of the first black millionaires, certainly one of the first female black, extraordinarily wealthy people. When she died, her estate was worth close to $800,000. Madam C.J. Walker, in fact, was very aware, obviously, not just of the hair care products that made her so rich, but of politics. Here she is in 1918 meeting with a famous Japanese publisher, Koiwa, in New York, with Phillip Randolph, another extraordinarily important African-American leader, a labor leader. And Madam C.J. Walker had a letter translated, which I'll show you in a second, written to the Japanese saying, in effect, you have achieved something that no other non-white nation has achieved. You've achieved power in the world's terms. And we are begging you to use that power when you go to Paris to propose a racial equality treaty. And it's well known the Japanese did this. A racial equality treaty which would say any nation, allied nation, could not discriminate against members of any other allied nation. That there had to be equality between nations. Well, this didn't work very well in the mind of Wilson, nor was it appealing to the Australians. And though the vote actually passed, it was through subterfuge, it was shot down and unsuccessful. And in a moment that I think is significant for the upcoming war, the Japanese instead took the took many of the German islands in the Pacific as a token, having been rejected in the possibility to give racial equality as a proposal. This is actually the letter which I found in the Indiana Historical Society that was translated, and the appeal is very strong. Just as Jews in Russia are persecuted, African Americans, millions of African Americans sit in America unable to achieve the rights that they are entitled to. And you, Japan, referred to by many of the time as the champions of the darker races, you are obligated to use the power that you've accrued to remedy this situation. In the 20s, there are lots of examples of African American-Japanese friendship that surprise people looking back, especially looking back with the idea, as is very commonly thought in the West, that Japan is quote-unquote racist, and Japan is especially racist against blacks. In fact, this was an enormously successful exhibition from the Negro Leagues. This is Biz Mackey, the pitcher of the Philadelphia All-Stars, who led a exhibition throughout Japan, and significantly, the exhibition was not only enormously successful, but traveled all through Japan, affording the players opportunities that, of course, were not available in parts of their own country. That is, to stay in hotels, that is, to participate in society as equals. This very faded picture, which I'll give a close-up of, is simply to say, of course, the woman standing closely to the players without any sense of social distance. And again, we can understand the emotional appeal of the idea that Japan, however much it was moving towards what might be called fascist, that's an argument in itself, but certainly a totalitarian state, and one that was quite abusive towards its neighbors. You can understand the emotional appeal for African Americans, for the nation of Japan. Does anyone know who this is, coquettishly dancing in between the Japanese language? Josephine Baker. So, of course, this is one of many examples of cultural interaction between black people and Japan at the time, in the 20s and 30s. And again, to make the point that Japan was fully receptive. At the same time, certainly there was a propaganda and a manipulative and a crass aspect to promoting itself as a non-racial empire. Japan also displayed in many, many ways a natural affinity for African Americans and black people that was not on display yet, even in Europe, and especially in the United States. Now let me just get to Du Bois, which is the heart of my interest, and I'd like to explain why. W.E.B. Du Bois is arguably the most important African American intellectual of his time, and in fact, arguably the most important intellectual of any background in America of his time. A pioneer of many fields, particularly sociology. He was one of the first people to look at African Americans from their own perspective, and I don't just mean that in an Afrocentric way. I mean that in the sense of using data, collecting data on African Americans to write about African Americans. Doesn't seem like a very, now it seems like a pretty commonplace idea. However, it wasn't before Du Bois wrote The Philadelphia Negro, in which he actually did surveys of black people living in one of the wards of Philadelphia, and then come to conclusions rather than sweeping generalizations, which had been the pattern before. In 1903, Du Bois wrote his most important book, The Souls of Black Folk. In that book, he outlined several important ideas. Probably the most important one is that of double consciousness. The idea that there will forever be between African Americans and the rest of America a question. Who are you? Where do you belong? Blacks are always made to feel, Du Bois argued, their two-ness. The fact that they can be American never fully, but also never fully something else other than American. And the other idea that's less well known today, but I think equally important to understanding how he regarded Japan, Du Bois listed the nations that had gone before, and each taking its place in the march of history. So for Du Bois, looking at Japan, emerging in 1868, the year he happened to be born, in 1905, defeating the Russians, Du Bois glossed over the other occupations that Japan had committed already because they weren't useful to his model of Japan as a benevolent uplift. Du Bois saw Japan as, in fact, creating a model which African Americans might follow in their own uplift. In 1936, Du Bois had been living in Germany for a year, in fact, Nazi Germany. He was one of the first people to say to him that he thought that the Germans were headed towards, he didn't use the word genocide, but that the Germans were headed towards very bad things towards Jews. But then something happens as he travels to Japan. As he travels to Japan, he in fact becomes extraordinarily enamored with what the Japanese have done all over, including in their empire in Manchuria. That Japan had established a puppet state in Manchukuo, and for Dubois this was a wonderful thing. It was incredibly efficient. It was a state that was well run, and as he said, a colored nation built by colored people for colored people. And for Dubois that was most important. Now for those of us who revere Dubois and his legacy, this is somewhat complicated and problematic, because he certainly was not aware and didn't really seem to care much about Japan's actions towards its neighbors. In fact, speaking in Manchuria to a group of Chinese bankers, he said to them, "Why do you hate Japan so much?" And the reaction that occurred, he simply wrote, "Chopsticks dropped." So he was unaware and unappreciative and unconcerned with Japan's aggression, because for him, Japan had achieved something truly remarkable. Again, the color line had been crossed. The problem of the 20th century, Du Bois had written, will be the color line. And the Japanese had done nothing short of desegregating modernity. That is, they could be Japanese and at the same time they could have all the trappings of power, which included at the time colonialism. What's the big idea of Japan having an army and navy, Marcus Garvey said. The idea is that they can do what they want and no one can tell them no. And in fact, I always thought that Marcus Garvey's fetish for uniforms came directly from Europe, but the more I've studied this, and obviously there's a lot of things I'm not telling you in the interest of time, the more I've studied this, I think that in fact his fetish for uniforms and marching and militaristic displays came from Japan. I show this picture of Du Bois. I think actually this building is down near Hevia Park. It's still there. It may be incorporated into one of the larger buildings. But I show this simply because it's with a very refined professor of music, Sakabe Shigeyoshi. And I include it to say that, in fact, the people that Du Bois corresponded with, his peers in Japan, were incredibly refined, sensitive, thoughtful people who, on the question of African Americans, were what we would say today in our terms progressive, and at the same time deeply nationalistic. The project of Sakabe, who is shown here, was to show how Japanese music was something organic to the Yamato race, to the soil, all of the things you would imagine that nationalists do to ennoble their cause over everyone else. And again, that's the tension that we have to deal with. That on the issue of African Americans, he was, for example, this guy and many of other of Du Bois's contacts were progressive, and on the issue of Koreans and Chinese, they were certainly what we would call retrograde and enabling of the empire that would allow, for example, the attempt to erase Korean culture. And that's, again, something that we presently have to deal with. Du Bois was absolutely enamored with the Shinkansen. On his trip from Kyoto to Tokyo, he gave what I think is probably the best description of anyone I've ever heard of the state of the railway. If you give me just one section, I'd like to find that quote. And if you know Booker T. Washington, who actually the Japanese started to notice, I skipped over a picture of him from the turn of the century, but if you know Booker T. Washington and his sort of fetish for cleanliness and the toothbrush and cleaning as a sign of uplift, you can say that Japan had the amazing effect. I said that it worked across the swatch of African American leadership. It also brought out the inner Booker T. Washington in Du Bois, and it also brought out his inner Garvey. One man who he begrudgingly respected and the other who he detested. Garvey and W.B. Du Bois, in fact, didn't like each other at all, and that's an understatement. But nonetheless, writing this Shinkansen, W.B. Du Bois writes, "I went through a land cultivated by the square yard, toiled over on hand and knee, drained and protected by hedge and ditch, bush and tree. There were white and gray homes, nestling low, clean and busy. Here is neatly piled straw, narrow roads and paths, railways and sudden factories, warehouses, rivers and canals. Always there are trees, bamboos, pines and maples. Shrines, stone lanterns appear, hills and lakes, and everywhere workers with bent backs. Lake Biwa flies by on the left, and a great mountain gray with snow. And of course that's Mount Fuji. But the problem with that description, and the problem with this image, is that this image was created by Japanese colonialists saying, come to not just Japan, but come to Asia as well. Come to the Asia that we control. Come to Manchuria and come to visit our beautiful country which we manage, our beautiful Orient. And so Du Bois's depiction of Japan as this wonderful, harmonious place is in fact loaded with the language of nationalism and colonialism that, again, for my point that I've made already, is something we need to reflect on. Du Bois was treated as a hero everywhere he went in Japan, in Kyoto and in Tokyo. He was interviewed by newspapers. He was feted as a great American hero. And his counsel was sought. We certainly underestimate the extent that the Japanese nationalists used African Americans like Du Bois to create their language of anti-racism. Unlike Nazi Germany, and like the United States, Japan presented itself as an anti-racist empire. And without a doubt, Du Bois and others were both co-opted willingly and also copied in creating that language and that rhetoric, which was both propaganda and deeply felt by Japanese people. And in this picture, which has nothing to do with Du Bois's famous quote, which I'm about to paraphrase, reminds me nonetheless of the quote where he says, "I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not." In other words, Du Bois's lifelong ambition was to be seen as civilized by those who he saw as civilized. And when he got to wear his Star of Liberia medal to a party given by a viscount, that is a relative of the emperor, Du Bois has his most happy moment. And when he leaves the Teikoku Hotel where he stayed with great accommodations at a discount from the government, which was so happy to have him, he said, "As I approached the desk, a white woman, interrupted the man checking me out. And as in America, he would have ignored me. But in this case, he turned to the woman and said politely, 'Excuse me, I'm with another customer,' and then turned to me with typical Japanese dignity," is how he describes that event. So again, for Du Bois, the most significant African American intellectual of his time, Japan represented civilization, harmony, and decency towards him, not just as a human being, but as a supremely educated human being. And I'll say very briefly that Japan also sought to create relationships with Ethiopia, provoking the despair and anger of Italy, its ultimate ally. But this was important again because Japan wanted to stake itself as the center of the non-white metropolis or cosmopolite of the world. And they did that through this careful cultivation of, for example, the Ethiopians. In fact, a marriage was arranged between the daughter of a viscount and a cousin of Haile Selassie, the emperor of Ethiopia. And although it never took place, it certainly made press that Japan had cultivated so that they could again assert themselves as the, in quotes, this is what was said of them, the champion of the darker races at Ueno-Zib with an Ethiopian delegation. This is Hikida, a fascinating character who toured America, including its historically black colleges and universities. Many of you understand that this book is the man that was loved the most by blacks and feared the most by the FBI. In fact, this was the case. He was hounded by the FBI, but he arranged Du Bois's trip. And also, and again, here's an irony we must confront ourselves with, he asked James Weldon Johnson, who is the author, among other things, of Lift Every Voice and Sing, taken as the Negro national anthem. He asked if he could have this translated into Japanese. Sounds like a wonderful multicultural project, although Hikida's intention was to have it set to military music so the Japanese could sing it in their battles on the mainland and in Southeast Asia. And again, Japanese nationalism presenting itself as harmonious. Each of the bands on the Manchurian flag represents a virtue and also a different people, the Han Chinese, the Koreans, the Japanese, and the Manchurians. All happy, and of course, under one emperor's roof, but the 8 corners of the world brought together in a co-prosperity sphere. Japan at the center because, hey, someone's got to be in charge. But, you know, it's all equal. And this is the kind of thing, again, that Du Bois and many African Americans, looking back with the values most of us share, we could say, unfortunately, believed in and helped promote. Of course, converse is the image of African Americans. I don't think the image on the right, the Australian one, is necessarily pejorative in the usual simian-like or the squinty eyes, big glasses, but certainly the hue of the gentleman implies the membership in the darker races. And on the left is an image you may have seen, it's well known, of the white woman being thrown over the shoulder, being carried away. Reminding, of course, that the opposite, the war was to fight Japan, a racist empire, not an anti-racist empire. And of course, in propaganda, the stripes remembered were not those of the Manchurian flag, but of the swastika, the flag of Italy, and the battle flag of Japan. Now this image is probably impossible for you to see, but it's important as we wrap up. In fact, there was no question of solidarity or sedition among African Americans, to quote the title of a book by Reginald Kearney, who really is the person that opened up this field of African American-Japanese relations. But nonetheless, the Japanese were extraordinarily surprised, starting about 1942 or 3, when American troops of African American descent were in fact not only not creating a 5th column, but signing up. There's very interesting journals you can find in the Diet Library, some of them having nothing to do with war or politics, that are reporting the number of black troops that keeps rising and rising as African Americans again pursue that plan of double victory, the idea of fighting abroad again so that rights at home could be secured. And this, of course, these are images of African Americans fighting. Nobody tell Clint Eastwood, but that's black people on Iwo Jima. And we also have African Americans in Southeast Asia fighting and dying in proportionate numbers. This image is really tragic and sad, and I'll explain it because you probably can't see it, but it's so profound. Because it's one of the first times that you see typical or stereotypical Japanese caricature in a black American newspaper, where this is from. That is the thick glasses and the buck teeth. And you see that on top, hinged to a bayonet, is the halo, a makeshift halo, of course the sun representing Japan, but a tarnished halo. A dagger is bleeding, and even more profound, I think, broken chains are bleeding. It says, the savior of the darker races, quite sarcastically, of course. The bleeding chains, I can't help but to believe, are, in fact, the statement that you, who claim to be the champion of the darker races, who claim to be the ones that would liberate the rest of the majority of the non-white world from Western domination and Western hegemony, instead use those broken chains to beat your neighbors into submission. And this, of course, is an enormous disappointment for everyone, including Du Bois, who still sees the racial aspect of the war and still believes that the bomb was dropped on Japan and not on Germany because the Japanese were of a different race. But nonetheless, no longer could anyone hold the idea that Japan was, in fact, going to liberate the world for any other purpose than the same domination that the dreaded West was so well engaged in for so many years. And yet, sympathy remains. In this image, also from an African American newspaper, Asiatics are colored too. An African American troop carrying a shovel, which was a symbol of the more difficult and less dignified work given to African American troops. If anyone's ever seen that amazing movie with Roosevelt Greer about the African Americans who saved a bridge, but then were given a throwing a shovel. Again, now the occupation forces are coming, and the African-American soldier says to the occupied Japanese man, "I know just how you're going to feel, bub." And on the ship, just like Perry's minstrel show, we see Dixie playing. And the ship is named Mississippi. And so the image is that the war is over, and yet the occupation will be a racial occupation. And of course, that takes me back to my beginning proposition that in fact the election of Obama was perceived in some ways as an end of the white society that had occupied a non-white nation. Thank you. And I have two quick just sort of codas, which is one, this image of Lincoln holding a African-American baby. The story of Lincoln is part of the beginning, this is in 1947, beginning the process of returning that racial propaganda and now saying America is the country where everybody can drink Coca-Cola. We don't care what race you are. Everyone can buy our products and we can be part of a international pan-racial metropole. And in fact, the story of America is one that is non-racial, including Japanese. And then finally, this issue of Superman. This is the real thing, by the way. I have it at home. Just kidding. This Superman from 1948 tells the story of Jackie Robinson. And you find hundreds of things just like this, that America is the nation of all opportunities, that our occupation will not be racial, it'll be kind and wonderful just like we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. I'll take the advantage of chairing this first question. Was there any African-American reaction to the defeat of Italian forces by Ethiopia about 10 years before the Russo-Japanese War in 1896?
Yeah, so that's great. Obviously, the Ethiopian struggles had enormous resonance all over, particularly in the Caribbean, but also in Black America as a symbol of resistance. And you know, you can say someone at Hampton pointed this out to me. Hampton, one of the oldest African-American historically Black universities, actually was founded in 1868 also, just like the birth year of Dubois and the Major Restoration. But someone at Hampton said to me, well, you say that Japan had such an impact on Black Americans. What about the Haitian Revolution? And what I would say about your question and also the Haitian Revolution was, crucially, the Italians, ultimately, the Italians were able to bring incredible devastation to Ethiopia in a way that was different than the Russians' victory, the Japanese victory over Russia, which involved the participation of Roosevelt, so that they were able actually to bring the President of the United States to get involved in signing a peace treaty, demonstrating a level of power that I think was significant. So it's not that there weren't inspiring events along the way, but I just think that the Russo-Japanese War is a particularly inspiring event because of its outcome and the power that Japan was able to leverage there after the war.
Thanks very much. I'm sure there are many questions from the audience. So, you're distributing the island? Good. So raise your hand and Alan will give you the microphone. No questions? I mean,
that's all right. I don't think I need a mic. Do you know...
We're not going to, we're taping it, so that's why we... Okay. I'll let you chair. I'll go.
Do you know what influence it had on the Caribbean?
Well, of course, there's Marcus Garvey, right?
Right.
And I mean, as far as the story of Ethiopia, and also obviously Garvey, is still, as I understand, enormously significant in the consciousness of Black uprising in the Caribbean, with, of course, the religious aspect as well. It's endured, but in a social political way, I think the Russo-Japanese War was more significant, in my opinion. But as far as the intellectuals from the Caribbean, of course you have Claude McKay, the poet, who was also friends with Hikida, the gentleman that I introduced. In fact, when Claude McKay felt he wasn't paid the proper amount by a famous Black philanthropist named Schomburg, he actually wrote a letter to Hikida in Japan and said, hey, can you lean on can you lean on Schaumburg so I can get my cash? And he was actually able to do it, showing the leverage. And Claude McKay, of course, is the poet that when Winston Churchill read we will fight," that very famous poem was actually written by Claude McKay, one of the major poets of the Harlem Renaissance.
I think you mentioning Claude McKay is a natural segue to my question. One of the things I found most interesting about the time period was the skepticism that someone like, why am I forgetting people's names, right? The skepticism of Langston Hughes when actually thinking about this sort of uprising of Japan is contrasted with this sort of exuberance of someone like W.E.B. Du Bois. And I know that because of your time constraint, obviously, you couldn't necessarily juxtapose those two things. But I was wondering, in terms of if you could touch on, like, sort of why that might be so, in terms of, I know this sort of racial project that W.E.B. Du Bois was engaged in was sort of paramount and, would cause a lot of, missing the forest for the trees in terms of what was actually going on. But I was wondering if you could sort of maybe round out that picture a little bit by talking about sort of Langston Hughes and his, sort of viewpoint on sort of the rise of Japan and how that might sort of be different in terms of viewing the two men, especially in the conflict.
Yeah, sure, I can do that. Although Hughes was actually and is enormously popular in Japan, and I believe came to Japan.
Yes.
So let me go within my time period so that I'm not speaking out of school, because things end for me around 1943. I just sort of don't know what's going on after that. The most skeptical person of all was, not surprisingly, the great Paul Robeson, who I just don't know any person. Maybe Frederick Douglass comes close to, well, maybe the other way around, but certainly in terms of having integrity, Robeson was someone who, although he ended up getting seduced by Russia, Robeson basically said, "I'm not having it. These people are up to bad things, and I don't care what color they are." It's pretty clear that they're abusing China, for example, in particular, and that they've done terrible things already. And this is, of course, even before the war. Phillip Randolph, whose picture I showed you, was also enormously skeptical of Japan, but for a slightly different reason. Remember, he was the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and his main task in life was to protect African-American labor. And he thought that he actually sided a little bit with some of the conservatives from the Hearst newspapers who were yellow peril type people, because he was afraid that mass immigration would actually make it even harder for African Americans. So in that time period, I would say Phillip Randolph, definitely Paul Robeson. James Weldon Johnson pretended to be a little bit against Japan, but I've actually seen the things that he did and bought in Japan, and I think he was pretty smitten. He traveled all over Japan and racked up quite a nice bill of ukiyo-e and kokeshi dolls and other things. So I think he's, but at least politically he did acknowledge that there was some trouble in the paradise that others were constructing for what Japan was. And then let me actually say something about gender, because Du Bois is one of the few people, to his credit maybe, not to consider Japan to be female or in the infamous words of MacArthur, adolescent. Most people at the time, even people that liked Japan, considered Japan to be a woman, and often in the Orientalist construction of a gorgeous, secretive woman hiding slightly behind the fan. But Du Bois actually saw Japan as a robust male. Now the problem was that for him meant that the Chinese were acting like little girls. They were laying down for the white man, whereas the Japanese were not. So you make a great point that it's not a universal appeal, that there was a counter response of skepticism. But I would say that the praise for Japan outweighed.
Thanks. I'm wondering, in literature, did you find any reference to African Americans from Japanese writers? I know, I think it's Oe Kinzaburo wrote something, but in the time period that you're researching, did you find anything in the literary field?
I haven't, but that's my own limitation. Basically, I'm trying to wrap up a history dissertation. Not that that wouldn't be a great thing to find, but no, I have not. And I think that the concern, in fact I know the concern, was more political than social. But the quote that I gave you in the opening part was from a novel from 1921. But again, it's of a political nature. So there was actually a famous nationalist in the 1920s who wrote some novels and also wrote discourse about Jews and about blacks, quite philo-Semitic and anti-racist. And actually it's worth checking to see whether he, Kametaro was his name, and see whether he did or not, but no, I have not found it. And if you do, please email me. There's a question here.
So, unlike my new friend, Mr. Hanawa, unlike him, I didn't take any notes. So now I'm wondering, have you published any of this?
I'm actually, as of today, I'm done talking, and I'm going to be writing for the next few months here in Japan. So I'm just like that close to getting all this as a dissertation. And my dissertation is about Dubois and his trip to Japan. And then yes, I want to publish, and I think that in America this would be really obscure and interesting to about 8 people, and I'm not even sure I'm one of them. But I do think that in Japan, that done in a certain way, this could have a wider appeal, and actually that's part of my reason for being here now, is that I want to find a way to have it published as a wider appeal in Japan. Because again, I think it still matters. I don't think it answers very many questions about the current situation of Japan, or even answers sort of the Nakasone question where he purportedly said something racist against America. It certainly doesn't help, I don't think at all, answer any questions about rag dolls and whether they're racist, or whether monkey heads about, that purport to be Obama are racist or not. But it's a really important time period. And I think some of the questions of nationalism and also racial romanticism really still matter today, especially because we're not finished with empires at all in this world. And I think these are things, whether you're on the right or the left, that need to be considered. So you can be the first person to buy my book. I'll let you know when it comes out. Professor.
You've made a number of references to black intellectuals over a period of time, and their take on Japan and their sort of interpretation of Japanese power. You're focusing on Du Bois, but I'm wondering how well was he able to convince the regular folk, black folk in the U.S. of, this is a country that we can get behind, and how successful was he at convincing other black people, particularly black Americans, that this was a country worthy of support?
So thank you very much. It's a great question, and I would say it like this. In fact, Du Bois, well, first of all, let's say Du Bois had a very, very long career, for those of you who don't know, and he actually said about himself, he lived from 1868 until the day before the March on Washington in 1963. And he said about himself, if I had died at 40, the world would have mourned me. At this point, it's practically a request. So he went through a lot of different phases in his life and believed a lot of different things. But I would say, and this is an unfair generalization, but I would say, but I believe it, that he was a brilliant representative of ideas of his time. And while he was a generator of scholarship, as far as his political ideas, they were more ground up. And then he became an amazing explicator of what was kind of already going on the ground. And I say that because the sense of Japan for African Americans at the period didn't come from Du Bois. To answer your question, it came from the black newspapers. And it came from the editors of the black newspapers. So the Washington Bee, the Chicago Defender, these papers were intimately involved with Japan from the very beginning. In the 19th century, this is the way Japanese people build houses, this is the clothes they wear, some of it replicating stereotypes of the mainstream press, but some of it actually quite new and interesting. And if you look at the way the black press figures the Japan-American relationship, and the way the mainstream press figures that it's quite amazing that the mainstream press becomes increasingly hostile through the 20s and the 30s, and the African-American press becomes increasingly enamored. And Du Bois reflected that, and he added to that some of the articles and things I quoted, he wrote in papers. And in fact, he corresponded, as he was in Japan, back to newspapers, and they were printed through the African-American newspapers. But the editors of African-American newspapers, while they debated China, whether to get behind China or Japan, they were quite positive about Japan. Japan as a model of uplift. Japan as a country that really had the interest of African-Americans at heart. And I think that's the direction it went. It went from, although as much as Du Bois would have liked to believe that it was top-down, I think it really was bottom-up.
Earlier you talked about W. Du Bois traveling to Japan and some of his many things that he did in the treatment of black African Americans. We talked a lot about, as we know, W. Du Bois as a man. As into the treatment of African women, or African American women, what was his views on how Japan treated African American women?
Well, I have to report, unfortunately, they were very typical of his time, he talked a lot about how the Japanese women were so wonderful, basically because they were docile. And I hate to be telling stories on Du Bois, who I love, they were, his ideas of the Japanese women were very much not really extraordinary given his time. But he also did see, at some level, and I think within Du Bois studies there's a lot of this kind of back and forth as to whether he was a sexist or not, how you would judge that given the time. But there is the sense that he saw liberation as being liberation of humans, and there are times where he makes explicit references to the full liberation of humanity will include the liberation of women. But when it comes to Japan, the picture of the, not geisha, but in the West people would say geisha, but the hostess leaning coquettishly on his shoulder, that's a happy man. And that's my unfortunate feeling. I wish I could just make up another story, because Du Bois is my hero, but that's the case.
One question, you alluded to it during the presentation, is with Japan as it modernized, so to prove that it was modern, and the one other aspect is trying to prove in a way that it had become white, without, though it was East Asian. It was something that you see to some extent. I think the focus at the Versailles conference was really on racial equality for Japanese, which is more than for racial equality in general. And afterwards, if you move forward, the Japanese government official, who has a great sense of humor, once told me, after he retired, that two of the great achievements of Imperial Japan was to have had Japanese treated as whites in Nazi Germany and as honorary whites in South Africa. And I think the South African example is even more interesting because in Nazi Germany, Chinese too had the same treatment. I mean, they were advisors from Germany, military advisors in China until the late 1930s. There was a Chinese embassy in Berlin, but in South Africa it was different because there were Chinese in South Africa who were not treated as white people. So I wonder how that fits into African-American perceptions of Japan, because it's, and I think it's something you alluded in one of your articles I read, that it's a way, the other narrative is we don't really care about the other quote-unquote non-white races, we just want to be accepted as part of the club.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to answer that. Well, actually, the racial equality clause was to be for all non-whites, and they did do that, of course, for strategic reasons, to shore up their sense of themselves and their claim to be non-racist, to be anti-racist, but also, again, I think it's propaganda that they genuinely believed. And the non-white races of the world believed that Japan was going to argue on their behalf, and were very disappointed when they didn't. The case where what you're talking about in America comes in 1922 in the Ozawa case. Ozawa was a Japanese American who sued to be white. And this does, going back to the black press, cause some tension in the black press, because it's like, wait, what? You know, all of a sudden he wants to be white. It was just like, hold on a second. I thought we were kind of fighting all this together. Now, Ozawa, to his credit, said this is strategic. I'm just doing this to to force the issue of race in America. But no, the racial equality was genuine. There definitely was a tension about becoming white or not becoming white. There were Japanese who lived in America who only associated with whites, who were insulted that they weren't allowed into country clubs. But then there were also, in Harlem, there were Japanese who were married to African-American women. So, of course, like any group, there was diversity, and it went both ways. The Japanese in 1942, I believe, in Kyoto, had a conference. Famous philosophers had a conference called Overcoming Modernity. In fact, they even used the word double consciousness. And I would like to believe there's a direct link to Du Bois. I haven't proven that yet. If I can do that, then maybe my book in America won't be so obscure. So that would be a real feat. But the Overcoming Modernity question was how, okay, so we have all this stuff. We have this army, we have this navy, we have this power, and we belong to modernity, but now how are we going to not be white effectively? How are we going to retain a sense of Japaneseness that is different from the other people of modernity? But it wasn't until that period, and again, this is the same period where they're starting to notice African-American enrollment in the army, that the Japanese even finally acknowledged that the co-prosperity sphere really was just about Japan. Up until that point, most of the public declarations were about harmony, getting along, and all the races of Asia being together and being equal. But they kind of gave up that shtick in the early 40s, about the same time that they were kind of coming out of the closet as feeling that Japan was something special, different, interesting, and not necessarily connected to the other non-whites of the world. So like anything, it's a progression.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
You told us the story about distinct individuals contacts with Japan and the background. The question is, was there something more organized about this? In other words, at the beginning of the 20th century, Japan, the government, the military, even those not with the government, were very active in sponsoring national liberation. Supplying, organizing things, supplying them with funds, transferring weapons, etc. I'm wondering if that kind of organized league from Japanese official and other non-official sources existed in your story.
Yes, thank you. Yes, the answer is yes. In fact, Du Bois himself was accused of taking money from the government of Japan. His response was, anyone who knows anything about my finances knows that I'm not taking money from anybody. But as far as organized efforts, in 1942, Hikida, the gentleman whose picture I showed you, was commissioned by the Japanese government to write a report, which he wrote, War and the Blacks. And what would happen, what is going to happen if there is this troop escalation. And Hikida, moreover, wrote a second piece in 1943 called African Americans and War Propaganda. Again, how to broadcast to black troops that they shouldn't be fighting for Uncle Sam, that they were fighting a war against, as the slogan in Vietnam became, fighting the yellow man for the white man. And this was organized, highly organized, but without a doubt, in the 1930s, people like Hikida, who's only the most famous, there's a whole slew, at least a dozen, of people that were touring the United States, giving lectures, convincing people that they should support Japan over China, and all of this was very much paid for. I didn't mention it because I haven't proved it exactly, but I think it's probably true that Negro League exhibition was actually able to meet Hirohito, and that a trophy was given. Someone's shaking their head, yes? I don't know if that's, that he actually may have even thrown a pitch from the mound. James Weldon Johnson has, I actually was at Yale University, his invitation to the Imperial Palace is something he saved. So my point is, again, that yes, it was organized, yes, there was a concerted government effort, and there was even, as I mentioned, a Bureau of Negro Propaganda that was created and ultimately run by Hikida.
Where was the bureau?
What's that?
Where was the bureau?
In Tokyo. It was a government bureau. Although Hikita himself lived all over, including in Harlem. By the way, when Marcus Garvey's first speech he ever gave, he shared the podium with a Japanese nationalist. And if you know the term Afro-Asiatic black man, it's a longer story, we don't have time tonight, but the Japanese gave funds to some of the early black nationalist movements with this idea that they would support, and there's lots of interesting stories regarding that. And there's a reason, by the way, that it's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, a word that even at the time wasn't in full, complete agreement, and now is sort of obscure, and no one really uses the word colored, but colored was chosen by Du Bois and others for this exact reason, that India, China, and I would say most of all Japan were forming a new world in which would be centered, in which black and brown life could be centered rather than vis-a-vis the West.
Great presentation, by the way. You may have answered my question already, but I was thinking about the propaganda aspect, whether this meeting between Du Bois and the Japanese was basically propaganda on both sides, both looking at their enemy's enemy as their friend, and not really a genuine meeting of equals.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a good question. And I would say both. And I guess that's kind of my gig. Everyone's got a gig, and here's mine. What we do as propaganda often becomes who we are, and not just in a crass way. People tend to believe it, but I think that I could write a book about how the Japanese manipulated African Americans, or I could write a book about how African Americans were friends of their friend's enemy, were friends with their with people that had a common enemy. But to me, to get at the real shape of humanity, we have to understand that in fact, things that are practical for us also happen at a deep level. And by the way, so I think it's a better story, but I also think it's a truer story that the passion that Japanese people had for black people was genuine. The empathy for the African American struggle was genuine. The sense that African Americans were at the advance of dealing with the question of double consciousness, the confrontation with modernity, the confrontation with the idea that modernity only belonged to white people, was something that African Americans realized had a precedent. So as much as Du Bois looked at Japan as the future, the ability to cross the color line, and the color line wasn't just a longitude or a latitude, it was a timeline, the Japanese could jump into the future. That sense was matched by many Japanese people that African Americans had already done the heavy lifting. So I'd say yes, propaganda, and yes, incredibly genuine, and that's the story.
My name is Sato, just a small business owner. Innocent Japanese about the African, American history or versus the Japanese development. But my sense about the Du Bois is giving me these couple of questions. During that age in America, how he became so intelligent that he was well accepted by the Japanese people. In other words, propaganda, yes, that's the motive, background, but how he was found by the Japanese government imperial, officials. And also, and the second one is, you said the genuine passion of the Japanese who treated him very well. Yes, I agree, because the Japanese ourselves were treated in a third-rate citizens. Those who were sent to Europe and America could see two different things. One is a physical weakness, and the second one is they saw how the black people were treated in America. So, Japanese had the great intention. I say great because that was the motive, one of the reasons, at least the propaganda, to free the Asian countries. But the problem they had was they couldn't find those who treated as victims of the imperialism in Asian countries, except China. They are too far, Indonesia or India. So that's finally they could find India in the end. But anyway, I think your analysis is just remarkable. I couldn't see.
Thank you very much.
I couldn't see these historical facts, and this is the first time that I heard the name of Dubois or Dubois or whatever. Thank you.
Well, okay, so two-part question. I mean, he became intelligent by being born a genius, which. And how did he get on the radar? Well, fascinating life. I'd recommend that you read his biography or read Souls of Black Folk. He actually was born in the North, not in the South, and lived a rather idyllic life until when he was a teenager. He gave a holiday card, a Valentine's card, to a white girl who rejected it, and that's the moment he gives. As of realizing his racial consciousness of his difference, the fact that he was black. Although he was quite light-skinned, he was very, very mixed. He came from a Dutch Huguenot and French background. He was very proud. He used to say that he had no WASP heritage, no white Anglo-Saxon Protestant heritage. But you know, he could have lived a different life. He went to Germany. It was very, very popular there, and he could have married a German woman. Some very famous black painter, Henry Tanner, just moved to France one day. Said, "You know what? I'm done with this." Moved to France, married a French woman, and that's it. Dubois could have done the same thing, but he chose to stay in America and very much in the public eye. So he was an activist and an agitator, and he put himself in the public eye, such that if you start to see in the 1920s, people from Japan are already writing him. And he's been identified as, in the image I showed you from 1926, as one of the major black leaders. As far as the second question, there's a lot there. I don't know if this fully answers your question, but something that I do think is important is the issue of mitigation. The Japanese were both for politics and also innately, among other things, anti-racist and philo-Semitic. In other words, they reached out to against the will of their German allies, they reached out to Jews all over the parts of the world that they conquered, and actually ended up saving thousands of Jews, refusing to turn over. For example, the head of the Tokyo Philharmonic would happen to be a Jewish person, and the Nazis said, "You have to fire him." And they said, "No, we're not going to fire him. And by the way, we signed a treaty with Germany, and so he's a German, so we're going to treat him as an equal." So they did all these things. At the same time, we could sit and spend 2 more hours or an hour and a half more listing the atrocities that the Japanese committed of horrific proportion. And my point is that neither mitigates the other. That the atrocities committed in no way, the genuine affection for African Americans in no way mitigates what the Japanese Empire did to Koreans and Southeast Asians at all. Nor does what happened, as horrific as those things were, nor do those in any way mitigate the fact that this regard was, yes, practical and political, but also genuine. Thank you. We have one more? Should we take one more? I don't want to get to the torture point of the evening. And therefore, I would like to go back to my first slide and review.
A few minutes ago, you mentioned a Japanese gentleman who sued to be white, and that the black press at the time sort of did a double take. Was there a similar double take when African Americans volunteered to join the army, part of the war?
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to describe. It's the Ozawa 1922, if you want to look at it into more detail. It's a fascinating case. But yes, what I tried to convey, and I will again, is that the Japanese press was deeply disappointed. And again, I know this because, for example, I was reading in a magazine that was dedicated to, I think, Go or Shogi or something that had nothing to do with war, although of course in 1943 everything had to do with war. But there's a comment about 100,000 more, 50,000 more black troops are now serving in the Army and Navy. And then, by the way, there's also articles written about slavery and Jim Crow and lynchings and things to remind at least the Japanese that they're fighting a racist empire. And I think you also mentioned this as well, to justify the fact that they were reacting to Western imperialism, which is how the Japanese justified much of what they did. We're doing what we're doing because the West gave us no choice. It's either kill or be killed. Very similar to the way slavery is rendered. Why did Africans sell other Africans as if Africa was one place with one country? I mean, the answer is obvious. They're different nations that were warring with each other just like Europe. But either kill or be killed, either sell or be sold. And the Japanese certainly presented their nationalistic drive as a defense against the encroaching West. So I thank you very, very much for your time. Do you guys mind if I take your picture? I keep forgetting to do this everywhere I talk, and I regret it, so let me just... there we go. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Our picture, I think when the first photographers arrived in East Asia, many Asians thought that there was something evil about it, it stole the soul. But traveling throughout Asia and in Japan, it seems that most Japanese have accepted photography. So I think thank you so much. It was wonderful. It was very enlightening. It was, I think, an eye-opener for a lot of people. And we're going to put this on our YouTube channel. So those who are not here those of you who are here can recommend it to your friends, and we hope you'll come back soon and give another lecture. So thank you so much. Thank you for coming.